private cemetery on the outskirts of the city was quieter than Hazel expected for a place that buried the powerful and the dangerous. She stood behind a marble angel monument, 40 feet from the grave, close enough to see his face, far enough to remain a ghost. 6 years living in hiding, and this was the first time she had found the courage to come here. Her hands trembled inside the pockets of her worn jacket. October wind sliced through the thin denim, but she barely registered the cold. All her focus fixed on the man in the charcoal suit, kneeling before a small granite headstone. Dean Hollis. Her father, the Mafia Boss whose name commanded silence across 3 states. He looked older than the newspaper photos she had secretly searched online during late nights at the library. Gray threaded through his dark hair, more silver than she remembered from childhood memories that felt increasingly like half-forgotten dreams. His broad shoulders curved forward in a posture of defeat she could never have imagined on the man her mother described. He placed a bouquet of sunflowers on the stone, bright yellow blooms against cold gray granite. Sunflowers. Hazel's breath caught. Her favorite flower when she was 9 years old. He was crying, not hiding it, not attempting control, just letting tears fall onto expensive suit pants while 3 men in dark overcoats stood at respectful distances near black SUVs. Security, the kind that came with commanding an empire built on fear and loyalty. Hazel pressed her spine against the cold marble angel, her chest constricting as she watched him touch the headstone with fingers that shook, the stone with her name carved into it. Hazel Marie Croft, beloved daughter, gone too soon. 2009 to 2018. She was supposed to be dead. Had been dead for 6 years according to official records, death certificates, closed investigations. The boating accident that never actually happened. The body they never recovered because that body was living 200 miles away in a rented house with peeling wallpaper while search teams dragged lake bottoms for a corpse that didn't exist. Her mother had orchestrated everything. Audrey Croft, who had spent 6 years telling Hazel that the man now openly sobbing over an empty grave was a cold, heartless monster. Dangerous, violent, someone they had escaped from or would have died trying. Someone who cared more about power than family. Someone who would have eventually gotten them both killed. But monsters didn't cry like that. Monsters didn't visit graves every single day for 6 years. Hazel had been watching for 4 days now, hiding in different positions around the cemetery, and Dean came every morning at exactly 8:15 a.m., regardless of weather. Rain, fog, bitter cold, nothing stopped him. He spoke to the grave. Hazel couldn't hear the words from her hiding spots, but she saw his lips moving, saw him trace fingers over the engraved name, saw him stay long after most mourners would have returned to their lives. This wasn't the behavior of the man her mother had described. The memory surfaced without permission, sharp and disorienting. Being 9 years old, her mother waking her in the middle of the night with frantic, wild eyes and hands that gripped too tightly. "We're going on an adventure," Audrey had whispered urgently. "Don't tell anyone, not even your father. It's a surprise." Hazel had believed her, had climbed into the car half asleep and confused but trusting her mother completely, had not understood when they drove through the night without stopping, had not known she would never see her father again for 6 years. The staged accident came 2 days later. Audrey had helped a man Hazel never saw clearly, someone who spoke in low tones and disappeared the moment the plan was executed. They abandoned their rental boat on the lake with enough evidence to suggest it had capsized. Audrey cut Hazel's long, dark hair in a gas station bathroom, dyed what remained an unremarkable brown. They used identification papers Audrey had somehow obtained months in advance, names that belonged to no one and everyone. The small town 3 hours west became their prison disguised as safety, a rental house with thin walls and neighbors who asked no questions. Audrey worked cash jobs, cleaning offices at night, waitressing at diners that didn't care about paperwork. Hazel attended public school under a false name, learned to flinch at unexpected questions, mastered the art of being forgettable. They moved every 18 months, sometimes sooner if Audrey decided someone had looked at them too carefully, asked too many questions, shown too much interest. The explanations were always the same. Your father is dangerous. His world is violent. The people he does business with would use you to hurt him, and you'd be collateral damage. This life is hard, but it's better than being dead. Hazel had believed her. What else could a child do? But the cracks in the narrative had started appearing 2 years ago. Small inconsistencies. Audrey's story about why they ran changed depending on her mood. Sometimes it was threats from Dean's enemies. Sometimes it was Dean himself who was the danger. Sometimes it was both. The details never quite aligned. And when Hazel asked direct questions, "Did he ever hit you? Did he ever threaten us specifically?" Audrey's answers became vague, defensive, angry. Then came the diagnosis. Audrey collapsed at work, was taken to an emergency room she couldn't afford, and received news that shattered what remained of their carefully constructed lie. Stage 4 cancer. Aggressive. Spreading faster than treatment could contain it. Audrey refused anything beyond basic palliative care, too expensive, too likely to require real identification, too dangerous if it put them in systems where Dean's connections might find them. In the final weeks, barely conscious on medication that dulled pain but loosened the grip on secrets she'd held for years, Audrey confessed. "I lied about him," she whispered from the narrow hospital bed in the charity wing, her voice papery thin. "Not about his work. That part's all true. He runs the organization his family built, and it's dangerous. But Dean, he never hit me. Never threatened you. Never gave me a reason to fear him as a father." Hazel had sat frozen in the uncomfortable plastic chair, unable to process what she was hearing. "I left because I was angry," Audrey continued, her eyes fixed on the ceiling tiles, unable to meet her daughter's gaze. "The divorce was bitter. He was going to get primary custody because of his lawyers, his resources, his family's influence. I couldn't accept it. So I decided if I couldn't have you fully, he wouldn't have you at all. You faked my death because you lost a custody battle?" Hazel's voice came out hollow, distant, like it belonged to someone else. "I wanted him to suffer." Audrey's confession fell like stones into deep water. "I wanted him to feel the loss I felt. I thought it would make the anger go away. It didn't. It just made everything worse. Made me worse." She coughed, the sound wet and painful. "I'm telling you now because you deserve to know the truth. Your father loved you more than anything in his world. I stole that from both of you because I was selfish and cruel." "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Hazel asked, tears streaming down her face. "Why did you let me believe he was a monster for 6 years?" "Because if I told you the truth, you'd have wanted to go back," Audrey said simply. "And I couldn't lose you, even though I'd already destroyed you by taking you away." Her skeletal hand reached for Hazel's, fingers like bird bones. "I'm sorry. I know it's not enough. I know sorry doesn't fix 6 years, but I am. I'm so desperately sorry." Audrey died 3 days later. Hazel was 15 years old, alone in a town where she had no legal identity, no family, no support system. She cremated her mother using what little savings remained and sat in their rental house for a week, unable to decide what to do with the truth that had shattered everything she thought she knew. Her entire childhood had been built on a vindictive lie. 6 years stolen because one person couldn't handle rejection and loss like an adult. 6 years of her father believing she was dead, mourning a daughter who was alive and being taught to fear him. Hazel made the decision alone in that empty house. She would go back. She would find her father. She would see if the man Audrey described in those final confessions was real or just another version of the lies. She used the emergency money Audrey had hidden in a coffee can, bought a bus ticket, and returned to the city she barely remembered. Now, standing in the cemetery watching Dean Hollis weep openly at her grave, Hazel knew with absolute certainty that her mother had been lying about everything that mattered. This man wasn't mourning for show. This wasn't performance for the security detail standing at a respectful distance. This was raw, devastating grief that had been carved into him for 6 years. Grief he carried to this place every single morning because it was the only connection he had left to the daughter he'd lost. Dean stayed for 40 minutes. He spoke to the headstone in a voice too quiet for Hazel to hear. He arranged the sunflowers with careful precision. He traced his fingers over her engraved name like he was trying to maintain some physical connection to a child who existed only in memory. When he finally stood, his movements were slow, heavy, like a man carrying unbearable weight. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, straightened his suit jacket, and became someone different, shoulders back, expression controlled, the commanding presence of a man who built empires and eliminated threats. The transformation was instantaneous and practiced, but Hazel had seen what existed underneath, had witnessed the truth her mother had worked for 6 years to keep hidden. As Dean walked toward the waiting SUVs, flanked by his security, Hazel made her decision. She couldn't stay dead anymore. Her hand moved to the pocket of her jacket, fingers closing around the small ceramic bird she'd carried with her on the bus from 3 states away. The bright blue and yellow painted bird Dean had given her for her 9th birthday, 3 weeks before her mother stole her away forever. Hazel had kept it hidden for 6 years, one of the only possessions from her real life that Audrey hadn't destroyed. She waited until the SUVs pulled away, until the cemetery returned to silence, until only the groundskeeper remained visible in the distance. Then Hazel stepped out from behind the marble angel and walked to her own grave. The sunflowers were fresh, their yellow blooms almost luminous against the gray stone. She knelt where her father had knelt, placed her hand where his hand had rested, and felt the carved letters of her own name under her fingertips. She placed the ceramic bird carefully at the base of the headstone, positioned it where Dean would see it immediately tomorrow morning when he returned to perform his daily ritual of grief. It was impossible for this object to be here. Dean would know that. He'd given her this specific bird hand-painted by a local artist, one of a kind, irreplaceable. He'd seen it destroyed in the accident, according to the evidence reports. Finding it here, at her grave, would shatter his understanding of reality, but it would also give him hope. And hope, Hazel had learned, was the most dangerous and necessary thing you could offer someone who'd lost everything. She stood, looked one final time at the headstone bearing her name, and walked away from the cemetery. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, her father would find the impossible sign, and the lie that had consumed 6 years of both their lives would finally begin to crack apart. Dean arrived at the cemetery at 8:15 a.m. exactly, the same time he'd arrived every morning for 6 years. The routine had become sacred, immovable, the one constant in a life built on variables and calculated risks. Marcus drove him in the black SUV, and 2 additional security vehicles followed at discreet distances. The precautions were automatic now, invisible, the cost of commanding an empire that operated in shadows. The October air carried the smell of dead leaves and approaching rain. Dean walked the familiar path through the cemetery with his hands in the pockets of his charcoal suit, his stride purposeful despite the weight that settled over him the moment he passed through the iron gates. 6 years hadn't lessened the grief. If anything, time had sharpened it, turned it into something chronic and inescapable that lived in his chest like a second heartbeat. He approached Hazel's grave with the bouquet of sunflowers he'd purchased from the same florist who'd been filling this order every morning since the funeral. The flowers were always fresh, always bright yellow, always tied with natural twine rather than ribbon. Hazel had hated ribbons, said they were too fussy, too fake. Dean knelt on the damp grass in front of the small granite headstone, not caring about the moisture seeping through his expensive suit pants. He placed the sunflowers carefully against the stone, adjusting them with the same precision he applied to business negotiations and strategic planning. Control was everything. Structure kept the chaos at bay. "Morning, sweetheart," he said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. He didn't speak much these days except when he was here, at this grave, talking to a daughter who would never answer. "Weather's turning cold. You always loved fall," said the leaves looked like the world was on fire in a good way. He traced his fingers over the engraved letters of her name, a habit that had worn the stone smooth in certain places. The cemetery groundskeeper had mentioned it once, suggested they might need to re-engrave the letters eventually. Dean had paid him an obscene amount of money to ensure that never happened, that every mark of wear remained exactly as it was, evidence of 6 years of daily visits. "I had a meeting yesterday with the Colombians," Dean continued, settling into the one-sided conversation that kept him tethered to something resembling sanity. "Negotiations went well. Your old man still knows how to close a deal. You'd have been proud. Or horrified. Probably both." He smiled, the expression bitter. Hazel had been 9 when she died, too young to understand the full scope of what her father did, but old enough to have started asking questions he'd struggled to answer honestly. How do you explain to a child that you run an organization built on violence and fear? That your wealth comes from activities that would horrify the parents of her school friends? Dean shifted his weight, preparing to continue his daily monologue about business developments and weather observations and all the mundane details of a life she'd never witness. Then his eyes caught on something that didn't belong. A ceramic bird sat at the base of the headstone, positioned carefully between the fresh sunflowers and the stone itself. Small, brightly painted in shades of blue and yellow, wings spread in mid-flight. The colors were slightly faded, the glaze cracked in places from age, but Dean would have recognized it anywhere. His heart stopped. Actually stopped beating for 3 full seconds before slamming back to life with painful force. That bird. That specific, impossible bird. He'd bought it for Hazel's 9th birthday from a local artist in the village 20 minutes from their estate. The artist had been elderly, specialized in hand-painted ceramics, created each piece as a one-of-a-kind work. Dean remembered the transaction clearly because Hazel had been with him, had spotted the bird in the artist's studio window, and pressed her face against the glass with such longing that Dean had walked inside immediately and paid whatever price the artist named. Hazel had carried that bird everywhere for 3 weeks. It had been in her backpack when she'd gone on the boat trip with her mother. The trip that had ended in the accident that killed them both. The police had recovered fragments of the backpack, waterlogged and torn, during the investigation. No bodies, but enough evidence to confirm the deaths, including pieces of a shattered ceramic bird that forensics had catalogued and photographed. Dean had kept the forensics report, had stared at the photos of broken ceramic countless times, torturing himself with physical evidence of his daughter's last moments. This bird shouldn't exist, couldn't exist. He reached for it with hands that trembled, something Dean Hollis's hands never did. His fingers closed around smooth ceramic still cool from the morning air. Real, solid, impossible. The world tilted. Dean's vision narrowed to the object in his hands, his mind racing through explanations that all collapsed under the weight of impossibility. Replica? No, the wear patterns were wrong. Too authentic, consistent with 6 years of aging. The crack in the left wing matched exactly what he remembered. Even the way the paint had chipped near the base was identical. Boss. Marcus's voice came from somewhere behind him, concerned. Everything all right? Dean couldn't answer, couldn't speak. His throat had closed around words that refused to form. He turned the bird over in his hands, searching for something, anything that would make this make sense. On the bottom, barely visible, he found what he was looking for. Initials carved into the base. H. M. C. Hazel Marie Croft. She'd done that herself with a screwdriver from Dean's workshop, careful and deliberate, marking her ownership. He'd scolded her gently about damaging the art, but secretly he'd been pleased by her possessiveness, her need to claim the bird as definitively hers. Dean stood abruptly, nearly losing his balance. Marcus moved forward instinctively, but Dean waved him off with a sharp gesture. His eyes scanned the cemetery, looking for something, someone, any explanation for how this object had appeared on his daughter's grave. The cemetery was empty, except for his security team and a groundskeeper visible in the distance. No suspicious figures, no obvious observers, just manicured grass and granite stones, and the morning fog beginning to burn off under weak sunlight. Marcus, Dean said, his voice strange even to his own ears. Get the forensics team, now. I want this entire area processed. Fingerprints, footprints, security footage from every camera within a mile radius. And find out who's been in this cemetery in the last 24 hours. Names, photos, everything. Boss, what's going? Do it now. Dean's voice dropped to something cold and absolute, the tone that ended arguments and compelled immediate action. Marcus pulled out his phone, already dialing, moving away to make the calls that would set dozens of people in motion. Dean remained frozen in place, the ceramic bird clutched in his hands like a grenade that might detonate. Someone had placed this here. Someone who had access to an object that shouldn't exist. Someone who knew its significance. Someone who wanted Dean to find it. Why? Extortion? Psychological warfare? Some elaborate revenge plot from enemies who'd somehow discovered the deepest wound in his armor. Or, the thought surfaced unbidden, impossible. The kind of desperate hope Dean had trained himself to destroy on sight because hope was dangerous. Hope made you vulnerable. Hope could kill you faster than any bullet. Or something else entirely. Dean knelt again, this time examining the ground around the grave with the focused attention he usually reserved for crime scenes and business negotiations. The grass was disturbed near where the bird had been placed, not trampled but compressed, like someone had knelt here recently. Small impressions, lightweight. He looked at the headstone, at the sunflowers he'd just placed, at the ceramic bird that shouldn't exist. For 6 years, he'd performed the same ritual, spoken to empty air, maintained connection to a daughter who existed only in memory and carved granite. What if he'd been wrong? What if the impossible wasn't impossible? Dean stood, the bird still clutched in his hand, and looked at Marcus, who was finishing his calls. I want results within 6 hours, Dean said, his voice steady now, controlled. The voice of a man who commanded empires and expected absolute obedience. Every resource we have, every contact, every avenue, I don't care what it costs or who we have to pressure. Find out where this came from. Marcus nodded, recognizing the tone, understanding without explanation that everything had just changed. Dean took one final look at the grave, at the name carved in stone, at the flowers bright against gray granite. Then he walked back to the SUV with the ceramic bird in his pocket, and 6 years of certainty crumbling like sandcastles against an incoming tide. Someone had left him a message, and Dean Hollis was going to find out who, why, and what it meant if it destroyed everything in the process. The conference room in Dean's downtown office building was sterile and secure, swept for surveillance twice daily, with windows that were bulletproof and treated to prevent exterior monitoring. Dean stood at the head of the long table, the ceramic bird positioned in the center under a bright examination light. Around him sat the people he trusted most: Marcus, his head of security; Victoria Chen, his forensics specialist who'd worked with law enforcement before Dean had offered her triple her government salary; and James Reeves, a private investigator who specialized in the kind of cases that never appeared in official records. "Tell me something I don't know," Dean said, his voice flat. He'd been awake for 36 hours, surviving on coffee and the manic energy that came from impossible questions demanding answers. Victoria adjusted her glasses and pulled up images on the wall-mounted screen. The fingerprints on the bird are smudged, deliberately wiped but not completely eliminated. I found 3 partial prints, all belonging to the same person. Small hands, female, young based on ridge density. I ran them through every database we have access to: APHIS, international records, everything. No matches. "What does that mean?" Dean asked, though he already knew. "It means whoever placed this has never been fingerprinted officially. No arrests, no government employment, no military service." Victoria zoomed in on one of the partial prints. "But boss, there's something else." I compared these prints to the archived forensics from Hazel's belongings, the items recovered from the accident site. Dean's hands tightened on the edge of the table. "And the prints match the ones we found on Hazel's school backpack, on her water bottle, on the book she was reading." Victoria's voice gentled slightly. "Boss, these are your daughter's fingerprints." The room fell silent. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. James looked down at his notes, giving Dean privacy to process information that should be impossible. "That's not possible," Dean said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're telling me Hazel touched this bird? Hazel, who's been dead for 6 years." "I'm telling you the prints match," Victoria corrected carefully. "Which means either someone with identical fingerprints, statistically nearly impossible, or—" She didn't finish the sentence. Dean turned to James. "What did you find?" James opened a leather folder, his expression grim. "I went back to the original accident investigation, pulled strings with the county sheriff's office, got access to evidence that was technically sealed. The boat that capsized was found 3 days after the accident, washed up near the eastern shore. Significant damage consistent with hitting rocks in rough water. Personal belongings scattered, some recovered, most lost to the lake." "I know all this," Dean said impatiently. "I memorized every word of that report 6 years ago." "Right. But here's what's interesting," James continued. "The bodies were never recovered. At the time, investigators assumed the current had carried them into deeper water, or that wildlife had. Well, they stopped searching after 2 weeks, declared both victims deceased, based on the evidence of the wreckage and the impossibility of surviving that long in cold water." "Your point?" "My point is that no bodies means no direct confirmation of death. The declaration was based on circumstantial evidence, no matter how compelling." James pulled out several photographs. "I also tracked down the artist who made this bird. Took me 20 hours and calls to 6 different art galleries. She's 83 now, living in a retirement home. Still has records of every piece she's ever sold, meticulous documentation. She confirmed she made this specific bird, sold it to you in May 6 years ago. Only one in existence." Dean stared at the photographs, showing the artist's ledger, his own signature on a receipt dated 3 weeks before Hazel's birthday. "So we confirm what I already knew. This is the same bird, which means it survived an accident that destroyed everything else, ended up somewhere for 6 years, and mysteriously appeared on Hazel's grave yesterday morning. Or," Victoria said quietly, "it means the bird was never in the accident." The words hung in the air like smoke. Dean turned to face her. "Explain." "The forensics report from the accident listed a broken ceramic bird among recovered items," Victoria said, pulling up the old report on screen. "But boss, I compared the fragments photographed 6 years ago to this intact bird. The colors are wrong. The size is wrong. The shape doesn't match. Someone provided a broken ceramic bird for the evidence log, but it wasn't this one. Someone planted false evidence," Marcus said, understanding clicking into place. "Someone wanted investigators to believe the bird was destroyed in the accident, which means someone was staging the scene," Dean said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "Someone wanted us to believe Hazel died in that accident, and they were careful enough to include specific personal effects in the evidence to make it convincing." "There's more," James said, opening another file. "I pulled phone records from the week before the accident. Audrey's cell phone. She made 17 calls to a number registered to a prepaid phone. Untraceable. The calls started 3 months before the accident and stopped the day after. Someone was helping her plan something. Dean felt cold rage settling over him, the kind of cold that preceded violence and irreversible decisions. You're telling me Audrey staged the accident, faked Hazel's death, had help doing it? I'm saying the evidence points to a staged event, James corrected carefully. Whether Hazel survived or whether Audrey staged it alone, I can't confirm yet. The fingerprints confirm she survived, Victoria said. Those are fresh prints on the bird, maybe a few days old. Someone alive touched this recently and placed it on that grave. Dean walked to the window, staring out at the city 40 stories below. His mind was racing through implications, through the 6 years of grief that had consumed him, through the mornings spent weeping at a grave that might have been empty from the beginning, through the rage that was building like pressure in a sealed container, demanding release. Find Audrey, he said, not turning around. I don't care where she is, what name she's using, how deep she's hiding. Find her. Boss, Marcus said carefully. If Hazel is alive. If Hazel is alive, Dean interrupted, his voice lethal. Then Audrey stole 6 years from me. 6 years I spent mourning a daughter who wasn't dead. 6 years of grief and guilt. And, he stopped, unable to articulate the full scope of what had been taken. We'll find her, James said. I've already got people running credit card traces, property records, DMV databases. If she's using her real name anywhere, we'll have a location within 48 hours. And if she's not using her real name, then we look for patterns. Women traveling with teenage daughters, recent relocations, medical records, school enrollments. She can't hide completely, not with a 15-year-old. Kids leave footprints. Dean turned back to face them, and everyone in the room recognized the expression on his face. This wasn't the grief-stricken father anymore. This was the Mafia Boss who'd built an empire through calculated violence and absolute control. This was the man who eliminated threats and destroyed enemies. When you find Audrey, Dean said, his voice quiet and absolutely certain, you bring her to me, alive, unharmed, because we're going to have a very long conversation about the choices she's made and what she owes me for 6 years of thinking my daughter was dead. And if Hazel's with her? Victoria asked. Dean's expression shifted, something breaking through the cold rage. Then you call me immediately. No approach, no contact, no action, until I arrive. If my daughter is alive, his voice cracked slightly. If she's been alive this entire time, then nothing else matters. Not revenge, not rage, not anything. I get her back first. Everything else can wait. Marcus nodded. Understood. Boss. 48 hours, Dean said. I want answers. I want locations. I want to know who helped Audrey stage this and why. I want to know where they've been for 6 years and what lies Hazel's been told. He picked up the ceramic bird, holding it carefully. And I want to know why, after 6 years of hiding, someone decided to place this on Hazel's grave. Someone wanted me to know. Someone wanted me to find out. I need to understand why. The meeting ended with everyone moving immediately to their assigned tasks. Dean remained alone in the conference room, holding the ceramic bird, staring at the fingerprint analysis on the screen that confirmed his daughter had touched this object within the last week. Hazel was alive. The grief that had defined 6 years of his existence was transforming into something else entirely. Rage at the betrayal, desperate hope that he might recover what he'd lost, and cold determination to find answers no matter what walls he had to burn down in the process. Dean set the bird carefully in a secure case, locking it like the precious evidence it was. Then he returned to his office and began making calls, setting in motion the full resources of an organization built to find people who didn't want to be found and exact consequences from those who'd made irreversible mistakes. Audrey had 6 years to run. That time was over. James called at 3:47 a.m. on the third day. Dean was awake, hadn't really slept since the bird appeared, was sitting in his home office reviewing property records and transaction histories for what felt like the 1,000th time. The phone rang and Dean answered before the second ring. Tell me you found her, Dean said. I found the paper trail, James replied. Audrey's been careful, but not perfect. She used her real name once, 9 months ago, to set up a utilities account. Small town called Millbrook, about 200 miles west, population under 5,000. The kind of place where strangers are noticed but people mind their own business. Address? Sending it now. But boss, there's something you need to know before you go there. James paused. The utilities account was shut down 6 weeks ago. Audrey's dead. Dean felt the world tilt. Explain. Local hospital records, cross-referenced with the county death certificates. Audrey Croft died of cancer 6 weeks ago. Aggressive, late stage. She was in the charity ward at the end. No money for real treatment. James's voice was professionally neutral, but Dean could hear the underlying tension. She had someone with her. A 15-year-old listed as her daughter. Different last name, but the age matches. Hazel, Dean said, and the name felt like broken glass in his throat. I can't confirm that without seeing her, but the timing fits. The daughter was present when Audrey died, handled the cremation arrangements, then disappeared. No forwarding address, no credit card transactions, nothing in any database. She's a ghost, until she placed the bird on Hazel's grave, Dean said, pieces clicking together. Audrey died and Hazel came back. She's been watching me. That's my theory, James confirmed. I pulled security footage from businesses near the cemetery. Found a girl matching the age and general description on the bus depot cameras 3 days before you found the bird. She's been in the city at least a week. Send me everything, Dean said. The address in Millbrook, Audrey's hospital records, the death certificate. All of it. Already sent. Boss, there's one more thing. I accessed Audrey's medical records from the charity ward. The hospital social worker made notes about conversations with Audrey in the final days. She was heavily medicated, talking about regrets and lies. The notes mentioned something about a faked accident and a daughter who'd been kept from her father. The social worker flagged it as possible delirium, didn't follow up, but the details match. Dean's hands tightened on the phone. She confessed. At the end, she told someone the truth. Looks like it. And if she confessed to hospital staff, she probably confessed to Hazel too, which means your daughter knows. Knows the accident was staged, knows you've been mourning her, knows everything her mother did. Dean ended the call and immediately opened the files James had sent. The utility bills showed a small rental house on the outskirts of Millbrook. The death certificate confirmed cancer as the cause, listed the daughter as next of kin with a false surname. The hospital records were more detailed. Audrey had refused treatment, accepted only palliative care, deteriorated rapidly over 6 weeks. The social worker's notes mentioned a thin, quiet daughter who rarely left her mother's side, and concerning comments about hiding from a dangerous man, even dying. Audrey had maintained the lie, had let hospital staff believe she was protecting her daughter from an abuser, rather than admitting the truth that she'd stolen a child out of vindictive rage and destroyed a father in the process. Dean read through the accident investigation next, seeing it now with the clarity that came from knowing it had been staged. The boat found damaged but not destroyed. The personal effects scattered but strategically chosen. The broken ceramic bird that hadn't actually been Hazel's bird. Someone had paid attention to details, had made it convincing enough to close the investigation, but not perfect enough to withstand scrutiny from someone with unlimited resources and motivation to find the truth. The forensics photos from 6 years ago showed the boat's interior, water-damaged and torn. Dean had stared at these photos countless times, torturing himself with images of his daughter's last moments. Now he saw them differently. The damage was real, but the scene was arranged. The backpack recovered from the water had contained some of Hazel's belongings, but not all of them, not the items she would have actually packed for a day trip with her mother. Someone had helped Audrey stage this. Someone with enough knowledge of investigations to make it believable. Dean made a note to have James identify who that someone was. They would answer for their role in this. Answer in ways that would ensure they never helped destroy another family. But first, he needed to understand the full scope of what had been taken from him. Dean pulled up the last file James had sent, security camera footage from near the cemetery, grainy and time-stamped. A teenage girl walking alone, hood up, hands in pockets. The camera angle wasn't great, but Dean could see enough. Thin frame, long dark hair, posture that suggested someone trying to be invisible. She walked with purpose toward the cemetery gates, paused at the entrance like she was gathering courage, then disappeared from frame. Dean rewound it, watched it again, and again. Trying to see his daughter in the grainy footage, trying to find the 9-year-old girl he'd lost in the 15-year-old stranger on the screen. The height was right. The build matched what he'd expect after 6 years of growth. But she was a ghost, a shadow, someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. What had 6 years with Audrey done to her? What lies had she been told? What had she been taught to believe about her father, about the life she'd been stolen from? Dean's rage, which had been building steadily for 3 days, crystallized into something cold and absolute. Audrey was dead, beyond his reach, beyond consequences. But she'd stolen 6 years. 6 years of watching Hazel grow, of helping her navigate school and friendships and all the normal complications of childhood. 6 years of being her father, of building memories, of being present for the 1,000 small moments that mattered. Those years were gone. Irretrievable. Lost to a vindictive lie that had served no purpose except to inflict maximum pain. Dean stood and walked to the window. Dawn was breaking over the city, pale light gradually illuminating buildings and streets. Somewhere out there, his daughter was alive, watching him, leaving signs, coming to terms with truths her mother had finally confessed. He pulled out his phone and called Marcus. "I need an extraction team ready within the hour. Full surveillance capabilities, non-lethal approach protocols. We're going to Millbrook." "You found her?" Marcus asked. "I found where she was, where she might have left something that tells me where she is now. And Marcus," Dean paused, his voice dropping to something dangerous, "if anyone interferes with finding my daughter, if anyone from our world or any other world tries to use this situation against me, they become a permanent problem. Understood?" "Understood, boss. We'll be ready." Dean ended the call and returned to the security footage, watching the ghost of his daughter walk toward the cemetery where she'd watched him grieve for a death that never happened, watched him weep at a grave that should never have existed. Audrey had made her choices, had committed an unforgivable act and maintained it for 6 years, had only confessed when death made continued lying pointless. Dean would never forgive her for that, would carry rage about the stolen years until his own death. But Audrey was gone, and rage was useless against the dead. Hazel was alive. That was what mattered. That was what every resource, every connection, every capability of his organization would now focus on: finding his daughter and bringing her home, regardless of what walls he had to demolish in the process. The ceramic bird sat in its protective case on his desk, bright blue and yellow against sterile packaging. The last physical connection between who Hazel had been and who she was now. The sign she'd left to tell him she existed. She was alive. She wanted him to know. Dean picked up the case, holding it carefully. "I'm coming," he said quietly, speaking to a daughter who couldn't hear him but who'd spent 6 years learning to be a ghost. "Wherever you are, whatever you've been told, whatever you believe about me, I'm coming. And nothing in this world will stop me from finding you." The house in Millbrook was small and forgettable, the kind of rental property that existed in every small town, vinyl siding that needed repair, a tiny yard with grass gone to seed, windows covered with cheap blinds. Dean sat in the back of the SUV parked 3 houses down, watching the place where his daughter had lived for 6 years, where she'd been kept from him, where Audrey had maintained the lie until cancer made maintaining anything impossible. The house was empty now. James had confirmed it the night before. No utilities active, no recent activity, the landlord planning to clean it out and relist. Dean had made a single phone call, and suddenly the landlord was very cooperative, very willing to give Dean unlimited access, very interested in not asking questions. "Clear, boss," Marcus said through the comm unit. "No one inside. No surveillance we can detect. Place is clean." Dean stepped out of the SUV, his security team immediately positioning themselves around the perimeter. He walked up the cracked driveway to the front door, which Marcus opened with keys the landlord had provided. The interior smelled like stale air and old sorrow. The furniture was minimal, cheap pieces that came with the rental. Nothing personal. Nothing that suggested anyone had actually lived here versus just survived here. Dean moved through the space methodically. The kitchen showed signs of basic use, dishes in the drainer that no one had put away, a refrigerator that still hummed despite containing nothing. The living room held a sagging couch and an old television. One bedroom was clearly Audrey's, the bed unmade, medical supplies still scattered on the nightstand, prescription bottles with dates from 6 weeks ago. The second bedroom was Hazel's. Dean stopped in the doorway, his chest constricting. The room was tiny, barely large enough for the twin bed and small desk pushed against the wall. The walls were bare except for a single poster, some band he didn't recognize, music his daughter had discovered without him. The desk held school books, notebooks filled with homework and handwriting he didn't know. A backpack hung from a hook, worn and patched in several places. This was where his daughter had lived for 6 years. This cramped, depressing room in a town she'd never chosen, with a mother who'd built her entire existence on a lie. Dean entered the room, his hands careful as he touched the desk, the books, the evidence of a life he'd been deliberately excluded from. A cheap laptop sat closed on the desk. He opened it, found it password protected, made a gesture, and Marcus immediately began working to bypass the security. The closet held clothes, girls' clothing in sizes that tracked the years. Smaller items that would have fit a 9-year-old, gradually progressing to teenage sizes. Dean touched the fabric, imagining Hazel wearing these clothes, living this life, believing whatever lies Audrey had told her. Got it, Marcus said, stepping back from the laptop. Password was weak. Hazel M2009, her name and birth year. Dean sat at the desk and began searching through files. School assignments about books he'd never discussed with her. History projects about events she'd studied without his help. Photos stored in folders that showed a girl growing up without him. Hazel at 10, at 11, at 12, still young enough to show traces of the child he remembered but already changing. Already becoming someone he didn't know. There was a document titled Journal buried in a subfolder. Dean opened it, knowing he was invading his daughter's privacy, but unable to stop himself. The entries started 4 years ago, sporadic and short at first. Mom says we can't ever go back. Says it's too dangerous. I asked her what Dad did that was so bad. She won't give me real answers. Just says his world isn't safe for little girls. I'm not a little girl anymore. Later entries showed growing skepticism. Mom contradicts herself. Yesterday she said Dad never hit her. Today she said he was violent. I asked her which one was true and she got angry. I don't think she's telling me everything. And more recently, I looked up Dad online at the library. Dean Hollis. Articles call him a mafia boss, say he's dangerous, call him a criminal. But the photos show him at charity events, at business meetings. He looks tired. Older than I remember. I wonder if he's still sad that I'm dead. The last entry was dated 5 days after Audrey's death. Mom confessed everything before she died. Said she faked the accident because she was angry about the divorce. Said Dad wasn't the monster she spent 6 years telling me he was. Said he loved me more than anything and she destroyed us both because she couldn't handle losing custody. I don't know what to do with this. Don't know if I can believe her now after 6 years of lies, but I need to know. I need to see him for myself. Tomorrow I'm going to the cemetery. Dean closed the laptop, his hands shaking. 6 years of lies, 6 years of Hazel questioning, doubting, trying to understand why her life had been reduced to this small room in a forgettable town. 6 years of Audrey maintaining a narrative that had already started crumbling, that had finally collapsed completely in a hospital bed when death made honesty inevitable. Boss, Marcus said from the doorway. You need to see this. Dean followed him to the kitchen, where Marcus had been searching through drawers. He pointed to a stack of papers held together with a rubber band, medical records, bills from the hospital, documentation of Audrey's final weeks. And beneath them, a letter addressed to Dean in handwriting he recognized as Audrey's, sealed in an envelope that had never been mailed. Dean picked it up with numb fingers, stared at his name written in the hand of a woman who'd destroyed 6 years of his life. He opened it. Dean, if you're reading this, I'm dead, and Hazel somehow found a way to get this to you. Or you found it yourself. Either way, you deserve to know the truth directly from me, not secondhand. I faked the accident, hired someone to help me stage it, make it convincing enough to stop the search. I took Hazel and ran because I was angry and vindictive, and couldn't handle losing custody. There was no cartel hit, no danger from your enemies, no protection involved, just a bitter ex-wife who wanted you to suffer. For 6 years, I maintained the lie. Told Hazel you were dangerous, that your world would destroy her, that we had to hide. I convinced myself I was protecting her. But the truth is, I was protecting my own ego, my own rage, my inability to accept that the court would favor you. I cost Hazel 6 years of having a father who loved her. I cost you 6 years of watching your daughter grow. I destroyed both of you because I couldn't control my own emotions like an adult. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Don't deserve it. But I'm asking you to understand that Hazel is innocent. She believed the lies because children believe their parents. She questioned them as she got older, but she stayed loyal because that's what daughters do. Don't punish her for my choices. She's strong. Stronger than I ever was. She survived 6 years of poverty and isolation and my increasing bitterness. She deserves better than what I gave her. Deserves better than what I took from her. Give her the life I stole. Build something with her that survives my mistakes. Be the father I kept her from having. Audrey. Dean read the letter 3 times, his hands crushing the paper. The confirmation was there, spelled out in Audrey's own handwriting. The accident had been staged. The death faked. The 6 years of grief deliberately inflicted out of vindictive rage disguised as protection. Audrey was dead. Beyond his reach. Beyond consequences. Beyond the justice Dean desperately wanted to exact. He looked around the house that had been Hazel's prison, small rooms and cheap furniture, and the weight of lies that had defined everything. His daughter had lived here, had done homework at that desk, slept in that narrow bed, worn those patched clothes, had believed she was living in necessary hiding, rather than recognizing she was being kept from a father who would have given her everything. Dean's phone rang. Marcus's voice came through. "Boss, I've got something." Security footage from the bus station in town, dated 3 days after Audrey's death. Girl matching Hazel's description buying a ticket to the city. And he paused. I tracked her through subsequent footage. She's been staying at the Riverview Motel, 3 blocks from the cemetery. Room 6. She's there now. Dean was moving before Marcus finished speaking, out of the house that stank of lies and loss, into the SUV where his driver was already pulling away from the curb. The small town blurred past as they headed for the highway, back toward the city where his daughter had been hiding in plain sight, 3 blocks from the cemetery where she'd watched him grieve. Audrey had made her choices, had confessed her sins in a letter that could never undo the damage, had died believing she'd at least told the truth at the end, as if that made 6 years of lies forgivable. It didn't. Nothing made it forgivable. But Audrey was dead and Hazel was alive, and Dean's choice was simple: spend his energy raging at a woman beyond consequences, or spend it reclaiming the daughter who'd been stolen from him. Dean chose his daughter. Everything else could burn. The Riverview Motel was exactly the kind of place Dean's organization dealt with regularly cheap rates, no questions asked. Clientele that valued anonymity over comfort. Room 6 was on the ground floor, window facing the parking lot, exterior access that made security a nightmare. Dean sat in the SUV 3 spaces down, watching the door with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for high-stakes negotiations. His daughter was behind that door, alive, real. 3 blocks from where he'd been grieving her every morning for 6 years. "How do you want to approach this?" Marcus asked from the driver's seat. Dean didn't answer immediately. Every instinct screamed at him to kick down the door, to see Hazel with his own eyes, to confirm the impossible truth. But instinct wasn't strategy, and strategy had kept him alive in a world that eliminated people who made emotional mistakes. "She's 15, Dean said finally. "Alone, living in a motel because she has nowhere else to go. I can't approach this like a business negotiation. She'll run. So what's the play? I need her to come to me willingly. Need her to believe she's making the choice." Dean pulled out his phone, opened it to the photo James had found: grainy security footage of a girl who might be his daughter. "Marcus, I want surveillance on that room. Non-intrusive, long distance. I need to know when she leaves, where she goes, what her patterns are." "You're not going in?" "Not yet." Dean stared at the motel room door. "She placed that bird on the grave. She wanted me to know she's alive. But she hasn't approached me directly, hasn't tried to make contact. That means she's scared, uncertain, doesn't know if she can trust me after 6 years of being told I'm dangerous. So you wait." "So I wait," Dean confirmed. "And I prove I'm safe. Prove she can trust me. Prove I'm not the monster Audrey spent 6 years describing." Marcus nodded and began making calls, setting up the surveillance Dean requested. Within an hour, they had cameras positioned at angles that covered the motel room without being obvious, had people in place to follow if Hazel left, had protocols established for observation without interference. Dean moved to a better position, a coffee shop across the street, with clear sightlines to the motel. He ordered coffee he didn't drink and sat at the window table, waiting. Hazel emerged from the motel room at 2:17 p.m. Dean's breath caught. There she was, his daughter. Not a grainy photo or security footage, but real, physical, alive. She'd changed in 6 years, taller, thinner, hair darker than he remembered. She wore jeans and a jacket too big for her frame, carried a backpack that looked like it held everything she owned. Her posture was careful, guarded, the body language of someone who'd learned to be invisible. She walked toward the bus stop 2 blocks down. Dean followed at a distance, keeping her in sight while maintaining enough space that she wouldn't notice she was being tailed. His security team flanked them at greater distances, professional and discreet. Hazel took the bus to the main library. Dean watched her enter, waited 10 minutes, then followed. The library was large enough that he could observe without being obvious. She went straight to the computers in the back, logged in with a guest pass, started searching. Dean positioned himself at a table with clear view of her screen, close enough to see what she was researching. Obituaries for Audrey Croft, articles about Dean's legitimate business holdings, news stories about organized crime in the city. She was doing research, trying to understand the father she'd been kept from, trying to reconcile 6 years of lies with whatever truth she was discovering. She stayed for 2 hours. Dean stayed for 2 hours. When she finally logged off and left, Dean followed again, maintaining his careful distance. She stopped at a convenience store, bought ramen noodles and instant coffee with money she counted carefully, returned to the motel. Dean returned to the coffee shop, positioned himself at the window, and waited. His phone rang. Marcus, calling with updates on surveillance. She settled in for the night, boss. Lights on, no movement toward the door. What's the next move? We maintain observation, Dean said. I need to understand her patterns, her mindset, what she needs. Then I approach. Boss, with respect, she's your daughter. You don't need permission to make contact. Yes, Dean said quietly. I do. Because Audrey spent 6 years teaching her to fear me. I can't undo that with force or authority. I have to show her I'm safe. He ended the call and continued watching the motel. The light in room 6 stayed on until nearly midnight. Dean imagined Hazel in there alone, eating cheap noodles, trying to process 6 years of lies and a mother's deathbed confession, trying to decide if the father she'd been taught to fear was someone she could trust. 3 days passed in the same pattern. Hazel left the motel in the afternoon, went to the library, researched, returned. Dean followed, observed, learned. She was methodical in her research, digging into public records about his business, about the organization he ran, about the legitimate and illegitimate aspects of his empire. She was trying to understand what kind of man he was, whether Audrey's monster description had any basis in truth. On the 4th day, Hazel deviated from the pattern. Instead of the library, she took the bus to the cemetery. Dean followed at a greater distance, knowing this was significant. She walked through the gates, moved with clear purpose to his usual spot. She stood there for 20 minutes, just looking at the grave with her name on it. Then she turned and began walking toward a specific tree, the large oak about 50 feet from the grave, the position where she'd been standing when she first watched him. Dean understood. She was remembering, processing, trying to reconcile the man who wept at a grave with the monster description that had defined her childhood. He made his decision. Dean stepped out from behind the mausoleum where he'd been watching, moved into her line of sight but maintained distance. He wanted her to see him, to know he was there, but didn't want to crowd her, corner her, make her feel trapped. Hazel saw him and froze. They stared at each other across 30 feet of cemetery grass. Father and daughter. 6 years and an ocean of lies between them. Dean didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, letting her look at him, letting her decide what came next. Hazel's hand moved to her pocket, pulled something out. The duplicate bird. Dean realized she'd had 2, one she'd left on the grave, one she'd kept. She held it up, showing him a question implicit in the gesture. Do you know what this means? Do you understand what I'm telling you? Dean pulled out the original bird from his pocket, held it up in answer. Yes, I know. I understand. Hazel's shoulders shook. She was crying, Dean realized. Silent tears that she wiped away with angry, frustrated gestures. Dean took one step forward, just one, giving her the chance to stop him, to run, to reject what he was offering. She didn't run. He took another step, another, closing the distance slowly, carefully, watching her body language for any sign of panic or fear. When he was 10 feet away, he stopped, close enough to see her face clearly, his daughter's face, changed by 6 years but still recognizable, close enough to see the confusion and grief and desperate hope warring in her expression. Hazel, Dean said, and her name and his voice after 6 years of silence made them both flinch. I've been looking for you. Since the moment I found your bird on the grave, I've been looking for you. Mom told me. Hazel's voice broke. She told me so many things. I don't know what's true anymore. She told you I was dangerous, Dean said. And that's true. I am dangerous. My world is violent and complicated and not safe. But Hazel, his voice cracked, I never would have hurt you. You were the best thing in my entire life, and losing you destroyed me. She said you didn't care. Said you were too focused on business to be a real father. I came here every morning for 6 years, Dean said, gesturing to the grave. Every single morning. Rain, snow, didn't matter. I came here and talked to you, to a daughter I thought was dead, because you were all that mattered. More than business, more than my organization, more than anything. Hazel was full-on crying now, shoulders shaking with sobs she couldn't control. She lied. About everything. She faked the accident to punish you. Took me away because she was angry about the divorce. I lost 6 years with you because she couldn't control her own rage. I know, Dean said gently. I found her letter. I know what she did and why. And Hazel, I'm so sorry. Sorry you were used as a weapon. Sorry you lived 6 years in hiding for no reason. Sorry you lost your childhood to someone else's vindictive choices. I don't know how to— Hazel stopped, wrapped her arms around herself. I don't know how to be your daughter anymore. I don't remember how. Don't know if I can trust this. Trust you. Trust that this isn't just another version of lies. Dean slowly, carefully, closed the final distance between them. He opened his arms, an invitation, not a demand. Then we learn together. We figure out how to build something from this mess. We start from zero if we have to. But Hazel, his voice was breaking completely now. Please let me try. Please let me be your father again. Even if it's hard, even if we mess it up, even if it takes years to undo the damage, please give me that chance. Hazel looked at him, at his open arms, at the desperate hope and grief and love clearly visible on his face. She looked at the grave with her name on it, at the flowers he'd brought every day for 6 years, at the evidence that he'd never stopped mourning her. Then she stepped forward into his arms, collapsed against his chest, and cried like the child she'd been forced to stop being 6 years ago. Dean held her carefully, like something precious and breakable, his own tears falling into her hair. I've got you, he whispered. I've got you, sweetheart. You're safe. You're home. I've got you. And in a cemetery full of the dead, surrounded by evidence of 6 years of lies and grief, a father and daughter who'd been kept apart by vindictive cruelty finally came home to each other. Dean sat across from Hazel in a corner booth at a diner 3 blocks from the motel. The location was deliberate, public enough that she'd feel safe, private enough that they could talk, neutral ground that belonged to neither of them. Marcus and his security team were positioned at discreet distances, watching for threats but giving them space. Dean had ordered food for both of them, though neither had touched their plates. The coffee was growing cold. I don't remember the last time we ate together, Hazel said quietly, staring at the untouched burger in front of her. I mean, I remember meals when I was little, but the details are blurry. I'm not sure what's real memory and what's just things I've imagined. You liked pancakes, Dean said. Blueberry pancakes with real maple syrup, not the fake stuff. You'd eat them with your hands because you hated how syrup made the fork sticky. He paused, the memory both precious and painful. You were 9. It wasn't that long ago. But I guess 6 years is half your life now. I'm 15, Hazel said. 15, and I've been dead longer than I was alive in your world. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. I don't know how to do this. Don't know how to be your daughter when I spent 6 years being told you were someone I should fear. What did she tell you? Dean asked carefully. Specifically, what exactly did Audrey say about me? Hazel wrapped her hands around her water glass, needing something to hold. It changed over time. When I was 9, right after we left, she said you were too busy to be a good father, that your work was more important than family. As I got older, the story got darker. You were violent, dangerous, had enemies who'd hurt us to get to you, said if we went back, we'd end up dead for real. Did you believe her? I was 9, Hazel said simply. What else was I supposed to do? She was my mother. I trusted her, and we were moving constantly, living in cheap rentals, eating ramen because that's all we could afford. It felt like hiding. Felt like the kind of life people live when they're running from something real. Dean felt rage at Audrey building again but forced it down. Audrey was dead. The damage was done. Rage wouldn't undo 6 years. When did you start questioning the story? Around 12, Hazel said. The inconsistencies got harder to ignore. She'd contradict herself about details. I'd ask direct questions. Did you ever see Dad hurt anyone? Did he ever threaten us? Did he ever do anything that justified this life? And she'd get defensive. Tell me I was too young to understand, that I should trust her judgment. But I wasn't too young. I was old enough to recognize when someone was hiding something. But you stayed. Where was I supposed to go? Hazel's voice held frustration that had clearly been building for years. I was 12, then 13, then 14. No money, no identity. Living under a false name in towns where we knew no one. And even if I didn't fully believe Mom's story anymore, I didn't know what the truth was. Didn't know if going back would actually be safe. Better to stay with the devil, you know. Dean understood that logic, hated it, but understood it. And then Audrey got sick. And then Mom got cancer and everything fell apart. Hazel's voice cracked. She refused real treatment, said we couldn't afford it, that it would put us in systems where you might find us. I watched her die slowly because she was more committed to hiding than to surviving. She looked directly at Dean. In the last weeks, when the pain medication made her honest, she confessed everything. Said she'd lied. Said you weren't the monster. Said she faked the accident because she was angry and vindictive and wanted you to suffer. Said I'd been kept from you for no reason except her inability to handle losing custody. How did that make you feel? Dean asked, though he already knew. He could see it in the way Hazel held herself, the careful guardedness, the uncertainty, the war between wanting to trust him and fearing it was just another version of lies. Like my entire life had been a waste, Hazel said bluntly. Like everything I'd survived, the poverty, the isolation, the constant moving had been for nothing. I'd lost 6 years with you because one person couldn't control her emotions like an adult, and I couldn't even be properly angry at her because she was dying. Hazel's hands tightened on the water glass. She apologized. In the end, said she was sorry, that you'd loved me, that I deserved better. Then she died and left me to figure out what to do with the truth. So you came back, Dean said. So I came back, Hazel confirmed. Used the emergency money Mom had hidden, bought a bus ticket, came to the city I barely remembered, found articles about you online, learned what you do, what your organization is, learned that yes, you're dangerous. Yes, your world is violent. Yes, everything Mom said about the business was technically true. But, she paused, I also saw the photos of you at charity events, read articles that mentioned your donations, your legitimate businesses, the community programs you fund. You're not simple. Not just a villain or just a victim. You're complicated. I am, Dean agreed. My organization exists. We do things that are illegal and sometimes violent. I won't lie to you about that. But Hazel, the business was never more important than you. Nothing was more important than you. And whatever I am, whatever complications I carry, I would have protected you with everything I had. Would have given you a childhood better than cheap rentals and ramen and hiding. I know, Hazel said quietly. I watched you at the cemetery. Watched you cry at my grave. Watched you bring flowers every day. Watched you break down in ways Mom always said you never would. That's when I knew she'd lied about the important things. You weren't the cold, unfeeling man she described. You were grieving. Real grieving, not performance. And I realized I needed you to know I was alive. The bird, Dean said. The bird, Hazel confirmed. I kept it hidden for 6 years. Mom never knew I still had it. Never knew it survived the staged accident. It was the only real thing from my life with you that I managed to keep. When I decided to come back, I knew I had to leave you a sign. Something impossible. Something that would prove I was alive and that I'd come back on purpose. It worked, Dean said, his voice rough. Found it and it destroyed every certainty I'd built in 6 years. Knew it was impossible but couldn't deny the evidence. Spent 3 days investigating before I found the truth about the staged accident, about Audrey's lies, about where you'd been. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 6 years and countless lies hanging between them. What happens now? Hazel finally asked. I'm 15. You're a mafia boss. Mom's dead. I have no legal identity. I've been living in a motel because I have nowhere else to go. I don't know what normal looks like anymore. Don't know if we can just pick up where we left off like 6 years didn't happen. We don't pick up where we left off, Dean said firmly. We can't. 6 years did happen. You grew up without me. I survived without you. We're both different people than we were. We start from where we are now and build something new. What does that look like? It looks like you coming home, Dean said. To the house you lived in before. Your room is exactly how you left it. I couldn't bring myself to change anything. It looks like proper food, good schools, stability. It looks like therapy. Probably because we've both got trauma to work through. It looks like me learning to be your father again and you learning to trust me. It looks like, he paused. It looks like whatever you're comfortable with, whatever pace feels safe. You're in control, Hazel. I'm not going to force anything. What about your world? Hazel asked. The organization, the business. You said it yourself, it's dangerous. It is, Dean confirmed. And I'm going to legitimize as much as possible. Step back from the illegal operations. Transition the organization toward legitimate business holdings. It'll take time, but I can do it. For you, I can do it. The question is whether you can handle the parts I can't change, the reputation that'll follow us, the reality that my past means your future will always be complicated. Hazel was quiet for a long time. I need time, she finally said. Need to process everything, figure out what I want. Can I? She hesitated. Can I stay in the motel a little longer? Just a few days, while I think. Every instinct Dean had screamed against it. His daughter was alive and living in a cheap motel when he had a house with her room waiting. But forcing her would destroy the fragile trust they were building. You can stay, he said. But I'm paying for a better room. And I'm making sure you have money for actual food, not ramen. And security will be nearby, not obvious, not intrusive, but present. Because Hazel, you're alive, and my enemies don't know that yet, but they will. And when they do, you become a target. Because of your world, Hazel said. Because of my world, Dean confirmed. But also because you're my daughter, and I won't lose you again. Not to violence, not to running, not to anything. So you get your time to think, but you also get security whether you like it or not. That's non-negotiable. Hazel nodded slowly. Okay, I can accept that. A few days, then we talk again. Figure out the long term. A few days, Dean agreed. He reached across the table, offered his hand. But Hazel? However long you need to think, however long it takes to build trust, however complicated this gets. I'm not going anywhere. You're my daughter. You're alive, and I'm never letting you disappear again. Hazel looked at his offered hand for a long moment. Then she reached out and took it, their fingers intertwining across the table. Not a hug, not yet. Not complete trust, not yet. But connection, real, physical connection between a father and daughter who'd been kept apart by someone else's vindictive choices. I missed you, Hazel whispered. Even when I believed Mom's stories, even when I thought you didn't care, I missed you. Missed having a father. Missed the life I lost. I missed you every day, Dean said, his voice breaking. Every single day for 6 years. And now you're back. Now we get a second chance. Now we build something that survives the damage and the lies and all the ways we were both broken by this. They sat in the diner booth, holding hands across cheap laminate, beginning the long, complicated process of becoming family again. Outside, Marcus and the security team maintained their positions. Dean's enemies remained ignorant of the shift in his world. The organization continued operating without knowing their boss had just recovered the only thing that truly mattered. Hazel was alive. Hazel was home. Everything else was just details. 3 weeks after the diner meeting, Hazel had moved into Dean's house, but the adjustment was harder than either had anticipated. The house was a mansion in the wealthy suburbs, gates, security, rooms that echoed with emptiness. Her bedroom was exactly as she'd left it 6 years ago. Pink walls she'd chosen at age 8, stuffed animals she'd outgrown before the accident. A child's room for a daughter who was 15 now and had survived things that required more than cheerful paint and toys. Dean had offered to redecorate. Hazel had said no, not yet. Needed time to figure out who she was before deciding how to express it. So she lived in a preserved shrine to her 9-year-old self, sleeping in a twin bed that was too small, surrounded by belongings that belonged to someone she no longer was. Therapy helped. Dr. Sarah Morrison specialized in family trauma and reunification. She met with Hazel alone, with Dean alone, together twice a week. Progress was slow. Hazel was guarded, struggling to reconcile 6 years of learned distrust with the reality of a father who was trying, genuinely trying, to be present and safe. Dean was careful, hyper-aware of not repeating patterns, not controlling, not pushing too hard. But the tension was building, because Marcus kept reporting threats, increased activity from rival families. Questions being asked about Dean's suddenly changed behavior. Hints that people knew something significant had shifted. The longer Hazel remained a secret, the more dangerous the eventual revelation would become. And then there was the other complication. Audrey's mother, Hazel's grandmother, had learned somehow that her granddaughter was alive, a woman Dean hadn't seen in 6 years, a woman who'd blamed him for her daughter's disappearance, was demanding to see Hazel, demanding custody, demanding that Dean be kept away from the granddaughter he'd driven into hiding through his dangerous life choices. The legal threats had started 3 days ago. Official letters from lawyers Dean had immediately recognized as enemies leveraging a family situation for strategic advantage. They claimed Hazel was in danger, that Dean's world made him unfit for custody, that the grandmother had rights, superseding a father whose criminal activities endangered everyone around him. Dean had his own lawyers, better ones. The grandmother had no case legally. Dean was the biological father, had never been declared unfit, had legitimate resources to provide for his daughter. But the threat wasn't really legal. It was political. Someone was using Hazel's grandmother as a weapon, stirring family conflict to destabilize Dean's position. And Hazel was caught in the middle. She sat now in Dean's office, arms crossed, expression closed. The grandmother, Margaret Croft, sat across from her, tears streaming down her face, hands reaching toward a granddaughter she hadn't seen since the staged funeral. Dean stood near the window, forcing himself to remain calm while his world threatened to fragment again. "Hazel, sweetheart, please," Margaret was saying. "I can protect you, can give you a normal life. You don't have to stay in this world," she gestured around the expensive office. "This dangerous world that your mother died trying to escape." "Mom didn't die trying to escape," Hazel said flatly. "She died of cancer because she refused proper treatment. And she didn't fake the accident to escape danger. She faked it to punish Dad. She confessed that to me before she died. So your story doesn't match reality." Margaret's expression hardened. "Your mother was terrified. Terrified of what your father's business would do to you. She had good reason to run. She had vindictive rage about losing a custody battle," Hazel corrected. "Those aren't the same thing." "You don't understand what you're defending," Margaret said. "Dean Hollis runs a criminal organization. People die because of his business. You're living with a man who orders violence like other people order coffee. That's not safe. That's not a life any child should accept." "I'm not a child," Hazel said, her voice sharp. "I'm 15. I survived 6 years of poverty and hiding because Mom couldn't control her anger. I watched her die slowly because she prioritized hiding over surviving. I think I've earned the right to decide what's safe for myself." Dean felt pride at her defense but also concern at the anger in her voice. Hazel was barely holding together, the stress of the past weeks showing in her posture and tone. "Your father is dangerous," Margaret pressed. "Audrey knew that, protected you from that, and now you're back in the exact situation she died trying to save you from." "Mom lied," Hazel said, standing abruptly. "About everything. About Dad being a monster, about danger to us, about why we ran. She lied and you believed her because it was easier than admitting your daughter made a vindictive choice that destroyed multiple lives. So no, grandmother, I'm not going with you. I'm not going to be used as a weapon in whatever game you and your lawyers are playing." She left the office, door slamming behind her. Margaret turned to Dean, her expression shifting to cold calculation. "She's traumatized. Anyone can see that. A court will see it too. Will see that she's being manipulated by a father with unlimited resources and questionable morals." "You have no legal standing," Dean said quietly. "My lawyers have made that clear. This conversation is a courtesy. Nothing more." "I have moral standing," Margaret countered. "I'm Audrey's mother, Hazel's grandmother. Family that isn't connected to organized crime. A court might favor that, especially if evidence emerged about the exact nature of your business operations." There it was. The real threat. Someone had gotten to Margaret, provided her with lawyers and information, turned her into a weapon aimed at Dean's weakest point. "Who's paying your legal fees?" Dean asked. "Because I know you can't afford the firm whose letterhead showed up on my desk. Someone's bankrolling this. Someone's using you. You're being played." Margaret's expression faltered slightly. "I have supporters who want to help protect Hazel. You have enemies of mine who see an opportunity," Dean corrected. "They're using family trauma to destabilize me. And you're letting them. Whether out of genuine concern or personal vendetta, you're participating in something that will hurt Hazel more than it helps her." "I'm trying to save my granddaughter." "You're trying to assuage guilt about not recognizing your daughter's lies for 6 years," Dean said bluntly. "Audrey called you during those years. You believed her stories about needing to hide, about me being dangerous, about protecting Hazel. You enabled the lie. And now that you know the truth, you're trying to rewrite your role in this, but there's no rewriting it. Your daughter destroyed 6 years. You helped her do it by believing without questioning. And now you want to take Hazel from me to make yourself feel better about that. I won't allow it." Margaret stood, her expression cold. "This isn't over. My lawyers will petition for emergency custody. A judge will have to evaluate whether your household is safe. And when they investigate, really investigate what you do, what your organization is, they'll side with family that can offer normal, legal, safe circumstances." "Your family offered normal circumstances," Dean said. "And those circumstances included enabling a vindictive woman to fake a child's death. I'll take my complicated, dangerous circumstances over that any day. And so will Hazel." Margaret left without another word. Dean remained at the window, watching her car pull away, knowing this wasn't finished. Someone was using Margaret to attack him. Someone who understood that family was his vulnerability, that Hazel's return had created an opening for exactly this kind of leverage. He needed to end it, needed to remove the threat before it escalated into something that actually endangered Hazel. He found her in her room, the preserved childhood space she was growing to hate. She sat on the too small bed, arms wrapped around her knees, looking smaller and younger than 15. "I'm sorry," Dean said from the doorway. "Sorry Margaret showed up. Sorry she's making threats. Sorry you're caught in the middle of this." "She thinks she's rescuing me," Hazel said quietly. "Thinks she's the hero. Doesn't understand that I don't need rescuing from you. I need rescuing from people who keep trying to control my life without asking what I want." "What do you want?" Dean asked. "I want people to stop acting like I'm a prize to be won," Hazel said, her voice breaking. "I want Mom to not have lied for 6 years. I want those years back. I want to know who I would have been if I'd grown up here. With you. In a normal life. But I can't have any of that. So what I actually want," she looked up at him, tears streaming, "is for people to stop fighting over me and just let me figure out who I am now." Dean crossed the room, sat on the bed beside her. "I can't control your grandmother. Can't stop her from making legal threats. But Hazel, I promise you this, whatever happens. Whoever tries to use you as a weapon against me, you're staying here. In this house, in your life, with me. That's non-negotiable. Not because I'm controlling you, but because you're my daughter and I won't let anyone take you away again." "What if she's right?" Hazel whispered. "What if your world is too dangerous? What if something happens because of who you are and what you do?" "Then I'll handle it," Dean said firmly. "I'll protect you with everything I have. And if that's not enough, if my world really does become too dangerous, then I'll walk away from it. I'll leave the organization, move us somewhere safe, start over. Because Hazel, you're more important than the business, more important than the empire, more important than anything." "You'd really do that? Leave everything you've built?" "I already lost you once because I didn't prioritize correctly," Dean said. "I won't make that mistake again. If the choice is between my organization and my daughter, there's no choice. There's only you." Hazel leaned against him, finally accepting physical comfort, her shoulder against his. They sat in silence in a pink bedroom that didn't fit her anymore, surrounded by the past, trying to build a future from the wreckage of 6 years. "The cemetery," Hazel said suddenly. "Tomorrow morning, I want to meet her there. Grandmother, I mean. And you, both of you, we're going to have a real conversation, not lawyers, not legal threats, just family. And we're going to settle this like adults instead of fighting over me like I'm property." "Hazel, I'm serious," Hazel interrupted. "This ends tomorrow, one way or another, because I can't keep living in this limbo where everyone's fighting about my future except me. So tomorrow, cemetery, 8 a.m. We talk, we decide, we end this." Dean wanted to argue, wanted to protect her from the confrontation, wanted to handle it himself. But Hazel was looking at him with determination that reminded him painfully of Audrey, the good parts of Audrey. The strength and clarity before vindictive rage had twisted it. "Okay," Dean agreed. "Tomorrow. Cemetery. We settle it." And in a pink bedroom preserved from 6 years ago, a father and daughter who'd survived the impossible made plans to face one more impossibility. The truth about family, about loyalty, about choosing futures over pasts. Tomorrow, in a cemetery surrounded by the dead, they would define what living actually meant. The cemetery at 8 a.m. was cold and fog-heavy, the October air carrying the smell of wet leaves and earth. Dean arrived with Marcus and minimal security visible enough to be reassuring, discreet enough not to be threatening. Margaret arrived with her lawyers, 3 men in expensive suits who immediately tried to position the meeting as a negotiation rather than a conversation. Hazel arrived alone, having insisted on walking from the house despite Dean's objections. She wore jeans and a jacket too big for her long dark hair pulled back, her expression set in determination that made her look older than 15. They gathered at Hazel's grave, the headstone that shouldn't exist, the flowers Dean still brought daily, the physical evidence of 6 years built on lies. Everyone stood in a rough circle around the granite marker, uncomfortable and uncertain. "No lawyers," Hazel said immediately. "This is family business. You can wait by the cars." The lawyers looked to Margaret, who nodded reluctantly. They withdrew, maintaining visual contact but out of earshot. Marcus did the same, giving them space while keeping Hazel in sight. "I'm glad you agreed to meet," Margaret started. "I didn't agree," Hazel corrected. "I demanded. Because this," she gestured at the 3 of them, "at the grave, at everything. This is destroying me. You two fighting over my future while I have no say. That ends today. Hazel, sweetheart. I'm trying to protect you, Margaret said. From what? Hazel challenged. From Dad? From his world? Those are just words, grandmother. Abstract concepts. Tell me specifically what danger I'm in. Name it. Make it real. Margaret looked to Dean, her expression accusing. His organization is involved in illegal activities. Drugs, weapons, who knows what else. People die because of his business. That's not abstract. You're right, Dean said, surprising both women. My organization is involved in illegal operations. People have died because of decisions I've made. That's the truth. I'm not claiming moral high ground here. My world is violent and complicated. Then you agree Hazel shouldn't be part of it, Margaret said. I agree she should understand what she's choosing, Dean corrected. Understand the full scope, the good and the bad, the legitimate and the illegal, the safety I can provide and the dangers that come with who I am. But Margaret, with respect, your daughter hid my child for 6 years based on lies. Your family history isn't exactly a beacon of healthy decision-making either. Audrey was trying to protect. Audrey was punishing me for winning a custody battle. Dean interrupted. She admitted it, confessed to Hazel before she died. There was no protection involved, just vindictive rage. So let's not rewrite history to make your daughter the hero. Mom wasn't a hero, Hazel said quietly. She was hurt and angry, and made a terrible choice. But she wasn't a hero, and she wasn't a villain. She was just, Hazel struggled for words. She was just a person who made a mistake so big it destroyed years of all our lives. And now you want to stay with the man she protected you from, Margaret said. Hazel, he's a criminal. How can you justify that? Because he's also my father, Hazel said simply. Because he spent 6 years mourning me. Because when I came back, he didn't try to control me or force me or take away my choices. He gave me space, let me decide. Proved he wasn't the monster Mom described. And yes, his world is complicated, but grandmother, your world enabled Mom's lies for 6 years. You believed her stories without questioning them. You let her keep me in hiding because it was easier than admitting your daughter might be lying. So which family is actually more dangerous to me? Margaret flinched. I didn't know she was lying. She was convincing. Because you wanted to be convinced, Hazel said. Because believing Dad was dangerous meant you didn't have to question Mom. Didn't have to face that your daughter was using me as a weapon. You were complicit, even if you didn't know it. So don't stand there acting morally superior when your enabling helped destroy 6 years of my life. The silence was heavy. Margaret looked at the grave, at the headstone with Hazel's name, at the physical evidence of how wrong everything had gone. I'm sorry, Margaret finally said, and she sounded genuinely broken. I'm sorry I believed without questioning. I'm sorry I didn't see through the lies. I'm sorry I enabled your mother. But Hazel, I'm your grandmother. I have a right to be concerned about your well-being. You have a right to care, Hazel corrected. You don't have a right to control. I'm 15. I get to have opinions about my own life. And my opinion is that I want to stay with Dad, want to rebuild what Mom destroyed, want to figure out who I am in a place that feels like home, even if that home is complicated. What if his enemies come for you? Margaret pressed. What if someone decides you're leverage against him? What if your choice to stay in his world gets you killed? Then I die in a world where I'm loved and valued, Hazel said bluntly. Instead of dying slowly in hiding, while pretending it's safety. Mom died in a charity hospital with no money for treatment because she prioritized hiding over surviving. She chose that death. I'm choosing something different. Dean had been silent, letting Hazel speak for herself, but now he stepped forward. Margaret, I understand your concern, understand you're afraid for Hazel, but here's what I'm offering: complete transparency. You want to know about my business? I'll tell you. Want to understand the dangers? I'll outline them. Want reassurance about security measures? I'll provide detailed protocols. You can be part of Hazel's life, can visit, can maintain relationship, but you can't take her away. She's my daughter. She's choosing to be here, and I'm choosing her over everything else, including the organization if it comes to that. You'd leave your business? Margaret asked skeptically. I'd burn it to the ground if that's what keeping Hazel safe required, Dean said with absolute conviction. I already lost 6 years. I won't lose her again. Not to your legal threats, not to my enemies, not to anything. So you can be her grandmother in her life as it is, or you can be the woman who tried to take her away and failed. Your choice. Margaret looked at Hazel, at Dean, at the grave that represented 6 years of lies. Her expression was complex, grief and regret, and reluctant acceptance warring together. "I want to be her grandmother," Margaret finally said, her voice breaking. "Want to be part of her life. Want to make up for the years I enabled Audrey's lies by being present for the years ahead." "Then you are," Hazel said. "You can visit. We can have dinner. You can be family. But on my terms, in my life, without trying to rescue me from the father I've chosen to stay with." "And the lawyers?" Dean asked. "The custody petition?" "Withdrawn," Margaret said, looking defeated. "I'll tell them I was wrong. Tell them I'm not pursuing it." Hazel's made her choice clear. "Thank you," Dean said, and he meant it. This could have been so much worse. Lengthy legal battles, public exposure, enemies exploiting family conflict. Margaret choosing to back down meant they could move forward, could start healing instead of fighting. Margaret approached Hazel, her arms opening tentatively. Hazel accepted the hug, awkward but genuine. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered. "For all of it. For enabling Audrey, for threatening you, for not being there when you needed me." "You're here now," Hazel said. "That's what matters. We start from here." They stood in the cemetery, 3 generations of wounded family trying to build something from the wreckage. Dean's security team remained at distance. The lawyers had retreated to their vehicles. The fog was beginning to lift, weak sunlight breaking through clouds. "I want this removed," Hazel said, looking at her headstone. "I want my name off this grave. Want this place to stop being a shrine to a death that never happened." "Can we do that?" "We can," Dean confirmed. "Today, if you want. I'll have it done today." "And I want to help," Margaret said. "Want to be part of removing the lie, part of building the truth." Dean pulled out his phone, made the calls. Within an hour, workers would arrive to remove the headstone, to fill in the plot, to erase the physical evidence of 6 years of lies. It wouldn't erase the damage, wouldn't undo what had been lost, but it was a start. "What happens now?" Hazel asked, looking at Dean. "Now we go home," Dean said. "We redecorate your room. We figure out school and therapy and normal life. We build something that acknowledges the past but isn't defined by it. We become family again, messy and complicated and imperfect, but real." "And my world?" Dean added, addressing Margaret. "My business? That's still reality, still complicated. But I'm transitioning, legitimizing operations, stepping back from illegal activities, building something Hazel can be proud of instead of something she has to justify. It'll take time, but I'm doing it. For her, I'm doing it." "And if it's not enough?" Margaret asked. "If danger finds her anyway, then I handle it," Dean said simply. "With everything I have, with every resource and connection and capability. My enemies know what happens when you threaten what's mine. They know the cost. Hazel is more protected than any person in this city, not because she's leverage, but because she's my daughter, and I will destroy anyone who tries to hurt her." The cold certainty in his voice made both women flinch. This was the Dean Hollis who commanded an empire, who eliminated threats, who survived in a world that killed the weak. But that violence was in service of protection, was the shield around his family, was the price he paid for keeping them safe. "I can live with that," Hazel said. "Can live with a father who's dangerous to his enemies and protective of his family. That's not a contradiction. That's just," she paused, "that's just reality. And I'm tired of living in fantasy, tired of lies and hiding and pretending. I want real, even if real is complicated." "Then you get real," Dean promised. "All of it, the good and the bad, the legitimate and the complicated. No more secrets, no more lies, no more children being kept from fathers because someone decided they knew better. We start from truth, even when truth is hard." They walked away from the grave together, father, daughter, grandmother, 3 people wounded by Audrey's choices, trying to build futures from damaged pasts. Behind them, the headstone that would be gone by afternoon. The flowers Dean had brought every morning for 6 years. The physical evidence of grief built on lies. Dean had chosen his daughter, had chosen family over revenge, transparency over secrets, difficult truth over comfortable lies, had chosen to be the father Hazel needed instead of the father his organization demanded. And Hazel had chosen him back, had chosen complicated reality over simple fantasy, had chosen the man who mourned her over the memory of a mother who'd lied to her. That was enough. That was everything. They left the cemetery as fog lifted completely, morning sun finally breaking through. Death was behind them. Lies were behind them. 6 years of grief and hiding were finally Finally over. Ahead was life. Complicated, messy, imperfect life. But life they'd chosen together. Life built on truth instead of lies. Life worth fighting for. And for a father and daughter who'd survived the impossible, who'd found each other again against overwhelming odds, that life was everything they'd been denied, and everything they'd finally reclaimed. 6 months after the cemetery confrontation, Dean stood in what had been Hazel's pink childhood bedroom and didn't recognize it. The 9-year-old shrine was gone, walls painted deep teal, band posters Hazel had chosen herself. A full-size bed with normal teenage girl bedding, a desk cluttered with actual schoolwork and art supplies. The room belonged to a 15-year-old finally becoming herself instead of a preserved memory of who she'd been. Hazel sat at the desk, sketching something Dean couldn't see from the doorway. She'd cut her hair shorter last month, said it was time to look like who she was now instead of who everyone remembered. She was still thin. Recovery from 6 years of inadequate nutrition took time but healthier. Color in her face, energy in her movements. She looked like a teenager instead of a ghost. "Dinner's in 20, Dean said from the doorway. "Okay," Hazel responded, not looking up from her sketch. "Is grandmother coming?" "She is, and Marcus and his wife. And Dr. Morrison, if she can make it. Small dinner, just family." "Your definition of family has expanded significantly," Hazel observed, finally looking up with a slight smile. "6 months ago, it was just us. Now we have actual dinner parties." "6 months ago I was a man mourning a daughter who wasn't dead," Dean said. "Now I'm a man learning how to have a life outside of grief and business. It's an adjustment." Hazel set down her pencil. "How's the transition going? The business stuff?" Dean entered the room properly, sitting on the edge of her bed. They'd reached the point where this was comfortable, him and her space, conversation flowing naturally. It had taken months of therapy and careful rebuilding, but they'd gotten here. "We've divested from all drug operations," Dean said. "Weapons are next, should be complete by spring. What remains is legitimate real estate, construction, investments. The organization still exists, but it looks more like a business empire than a criminal enterprise. Some of the old guard are unhappy about it, but they're adjusting. And your enemies, the people who might target us, still exist," Dean said honestly. "Always will. That's the reality of having been who I was. But we've strengthened security, established protocols, made it clear that you're untouchable. Most of my enemies are smart enough to understand that attacking you means declaring war. They're not that stupid." "Most of them," Hazel noted. "Most of them," Dean confirmed. "And the ones who aren't that smart, we handle preemptively. That's what Marcus is for." Hazel was quiet for a moment. "Are you happy with how things turned out? You gave up a lot. The organization you built, the reputation you had. You're becoming something different. Are you okay with that?" Dean considered the question. 6 months ago, the question would have had only one answer. Nothing mattered except having Hazel back. But 6 months of actually living with his daughter, of rebuilding their relationship, of creating a life that included family dinners and school events, and normal conversations had shown him something he hadn't expected. "I'm happier than I've been in 6 years, Dean said. "Maybe happier than I've ever been. Because yes, I gave up parts of the organization. But Hazel, I gained you. I gained Margaret, who's actually become someone I respect. I gained Marcus's wife, who makes him human in ways I didn't know he could be. I gained Dr. Morrison, who keeps us both honest about the work we need to do. I gained a life that's about more than business, and control and power. So yeah, I'm happy with how this turned out. Even though Mom did what she did, even though we lost 6 years, I'm furious about the 6 years," Dean corrected. "I'll probably be furious about that until I die. Audrey took something that can't be replaced, and I'll never forgive that. But I can be furious about what was lost while also being grateful for what we're building now. Those things can coexist." Hazel smiled, an expression that was becoming more common. Dr. Morrison would be proud of that answer. Very emotionally mature. "Your father is capable of growth," Dean said with mock seriousness. "Even if it requires expensive therapy and his daughter forcing him to actually talk about feelings." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Hazel returned to her sketch. Dean watched her work. This was what normal looked like: ordinary moments, casual conversation, being present without intensity or crisis. "I've been thinking about the future," Hazel said, not looking up from her drawing. "About what comes after high school, what I want to do, and I want to study art," Hazel said. Not the business side of it, just actual art. Painting, sculpture, whatever. Want to create things that aren't about surviving or hiding or lying. Just things that are beautiful for their own sake. Then that's what you'll do, Dean said immediately. Whatever school you want, whatever program, whatever it costs. You want to study art, you study art. Even if it means I'm not part of your world? Not part of the business or the organization or whatever you're building? Especially if it means that, Dean said firmly. Hazel, I'm building legitimate businesses. Real estate holdings, construction projects, investments. That's my world now, and it's fine if you want no part of it. You get to build your own life, your own career, your own interests. I'm not raising you to take over an empire. I'm raising you to be whoever you want to be. That's very different from 6 years ago, Hazel observed. From what I remember, you wanted me involved in everything. Wanted me to understand the business. 6 years ago, I was a different person, Dean said. Was someone who thought control and power and empire mattered most. Then I lost you and learned that none of that mattered at all. What matters is that you're happy, safe, living a life you actually want instead of a life I'm forcing on you. Hazel set down her pencil and turned to face him fully. I need to tell you something. About Mom. About what I understand now that I couldn't understand before. Dean waited, giving her space to gather her thoughts. She was wrong, Hazel said carefully. About what she did. About the lies. About taking me away. All of that was wrong and I'm not defending it. But Dad, I understand why she did it. Not in a way that makes it okay, but in a way that makes it human. She was hurt and angry and felt powerless. And she made a terrible choice because she couldn't see any other way to make the pain stop. That doesn't excuse it, but it explains it. I know, Dean said quietly. And I think, Hazel paused. I think I need to forgive her. Not forget, not pretend it was okay, but forgive. Because carrying anger at a dead woman isn't helping me. It's just keeping me stuck in the past. And I'm tired of being stuck. Tired of letting what she did define who I am now. You're allowed to forgive her, Dean said. That doesn't mean I have to. I'll probably never forgive Audrey for what she took from us, but you're allowed to make your own peace with her. Allowed to remember her as more than just the woman who lied. She was your mother. You get to decide what that means. Thank you, Hazel said, and her voice held relief. For understanding that. For not making me choose between mourning her and being loyal to you. They're not contradictory, Dean said. You can grieve your mother while also acknowledging she hurt us. People are complicated. Audrey was complicated, and you're allowed to have complicated feelings about her. A knock at the door interrupted them. Marcus appeared, his wife Elena beside him. Boss, Hazel, guests are starting to arrive. Margaret's in the living room. Dr. Morrison just pulled up. We'll be down in a minute, Dean said. When Marcus and Elena left, Dean stood, offered his hand to Hazel. Ready for family dinner? Margaret brought her famous lasagna. Elena made dessert. And I'm responsible for salad, which means I bought the expensive pre-made kind. Very domestic, Hazel agreed, taking his hand. Who would have thought Dean Hollis, notorious Mafia Boss, would end up hosting family dinners and buying pre-made salad? 6 months ago, I would have said it was impossible, Dean admitted. 6 months ago, I was still grieving at your grave every morning. Now I'm living a life I didn't know I could have. He paused, searching for words. It's good. Strange and domestic and completely different from what I thought my life would be, but good. They walked downstairs together, into a house that was finally alive with voices and laughter and the complicated mess of actual family. Margaret was in the living room setting the table, arguing cheerfully with Elena about napkin placement. Dr. Morrison had just arrived, was accepting wine from Marcus, who looked more relaxed than Dean had ever seen him. The whole scene was aggressively normal dinner party, family gathering, ordinary life. Dean had built an empire through violence and control and ruthless efficiency, had survived in a world that eliminated weakness without mercy, had commanded loyalty through fear and respect in equal measure, and he'd traded most of that for this dinner parties with his daughter's grandmother, therapy sessions, legitimate business holdings, a life built around family instead of power. It was the best trade he'd ever made. During dinner, conversation flowed around the table. Margaret was telling a story about Audrey as a child, carefully navigating memories that acknowledged both the good and the terrible. Elena was asking Hazel about school, genuinely interested in teenage girl problems that Dean still struggled to understand. Dr. Morrison was engaged in philosophical debate with Marcus about whether true change was possible or if people just became better at managing their worst traits. Dean sat at the head of the table and felt something he hadn't felt in years: contentment. Not happiness exactly. Too much had been lost for simple happiness. But contentment. The sense that this messy, complicated, imperfect gathering of wounded people trying to build something better, this was enough. "Dad," Hazel said, pulling him from his thoughts. "You're doing the thing where you zone out and look contemplative. What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking about how 6 months ago I was alone except for my organization," Dean said honestly. "Now I'm surrounded by people who know the worst things about me and stay anyway. People who call me on my controlling tendencies and push back when I'm being impossible. People who—" he gestured around the table. "People who are family in ways I didn't know family could be." "We're a weird family," Elena observed. Former Mafia boss, traumatized teenager, grandmother who enabled devastating lies, security chief, therapist, and me, the completely normal person who married into this chaos. "You're not that normal," Marcus said, smiling at his wife. "You married a man who's killed people. That's its own kind of weird." "Fair point," Elena conceded. "We're all weird together. That's what makes it work." After dinner, Dean found himself alone with Dr. Morrison on the back terrace while others cleaned up inside. The therapist was direct as always. "You've made remarkable progress," she said. 6 months ago you were barely holding together. Now you're hosting dinner parties and talking about feelings. It's almost disturbing how well-adjusted you've become." "Is that your professional opinion?" Dean asked. "It's my honest observation, Doctor," Morrison said. "Dean, you lost 6 years to Audrey's lies. You have every right to be destroyed by that. But you're not. You're building something positive from the wreckage. That takes real strength." "I'm building it for Hazel," Dean said. "So she has a life worth living instead of just survival." "You're building it for yourself too, Doctor," Morrison corrected. "And that's okay. You're allowed to benefit from healing. Allowed to want better than what you had before. The empire you're dismantling, it never made you happy. It made you powerful, made you feared, made you successful, but it didn't make you happy." "No," Dean agreed. "It didn't. I thought it did. Thought power and control meant something. Then I lost Hazel and realized none of it mattered compared to the only thing that actually counted. And now you have her back, Doctor," Morrison said. "Now you're building a life that includes her. That includes relationships and therapy and family dinners. That includes being human instead of just being powerful. How does that feel?" Dean considered the question. Terrifying, vulnerable, like at any moment it could all fall apart. But also, he paused, watching through the terrace doors as Hazel laughed at something Margaret said, as she looked happy and safe and present. "Also like the only thing I've ever done that actually mattered. The only thing I'd fight to protect no matter what it cost." "That's good," Dr. Morrison said. "That's healthy attachment, healthy priority. You're choosing family over empire, love over power. That's enormous growth." "I'm still dangerous," Dean said. "Still have enemies, still capable of violence if someone threatens what's mine. That hasn't changed." "No one expects you to become a saint," Dr. Morrison said. "Just to channel your protective instincts in ways that don't destroy Hazel. To be present without being controlling. To love without suffocating. You're doing that. It's enough." Inside, Hazel was helping Margaret with dishes, chattering about some art project at school. Marcus and Elena were playfully arguing about what movie to watch. The scene through the doors looked like something from a normal-life family gathering, casual evening, ordinary moments. Dean had never wanted ordinary before. Had spent his entire adult life pursuing extraordinary power, control, dominance, building an empire that commanded respect and fear. Ordinary was weakness. Ordinary was what other people settled for when they couldn't achieve greatness. But watching Hazel laugh with her grandmother, watching his security chief be human with his wife, watching a therapist who'd become genuine friend drink wine on his terrace, ordinary looked like everything he'd been missing while building his extraordinary empire. "I want this to last," Dean said quietly. "Want Hazel to have this life safe, normal, surrounded by people who love her. Want to be the father she deserves instead of the father my organization demanded. But I'm terrified I'll fail. Terrified my past will destroy what we're building." "You might fail," Dr. Morrison said honestly. "You might make mistakes. Your past might create complications. That's reality. But Dean, you're not failing now. You're present. You're trying. You're growing. That's what matters. Not perfection, just consistent effort." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the family scene inside. After a moment, Hazel appeared at the terrace door. "Dad, we're going to watch that documentary I mentioned." The one about the artist who spent her whole life painting one tree. You coming? Documentary about painting one tree, Dean repeated. 6 months ago I would have said that sounded like torture. And now? Hazel asked, smiling. And now it sounds like exactly how I want to spend my evening, Dean said. With my daughter, watching something she's interested in, being present for her life. You're getting soft, Hazel teased. I'm getting human, Dean corrected. There's a difference. He followed her inside, where Margaret had claimed the best seat, where Marcus and Elena were debating whether the documentary counted as entertainment, where Dr. Morrison was pouring herself another glass of wine. Dean sat beside Hazel on the couch, and she leaned against his shoulder in casual comfort that 6 months ago would have been impossible. The documentary was actually interesting artists dedicated to capturing one subject from every possible angle, every season, every light. Obsessive focus on single thing that mattered. Dean understood that better than he'd expected. He'd spent 6 years focused on grief, on the single loss that defined everything. Now he was focused on something better, the daughter he'd reclaimed, the family he was building, the life that mattered more than Empire ever had. Halfway through the documentary, Hazel fell asleep against his shoulder. Dean shifted carefully to make her more comfortable, not waking her. Margaret smiled from across the room, understanding the moment for what it was, father and daughter. Simple comfort, ordinary evening that meant everything because it could have never happened at all. When the documentary ended, Marcus and Elena said their goodbyes. Dr. Morrison left with promises to see them next week. Margaret kissed Hazel's forehead gently before leaving, tears in her eyes at seeing her granddaughter safe and loved and home. Dean sat alone with sleeping Hazel on his couch in a house that had been empty for 6 years and was finally full of life again. He carefully lifted her. She was 15 but still light, still recovering from years of inadequate nutrition, and carried her upstairs to the teal bedroom that finally fit who she was. She woke slightly as he set her on the bed. Documentary over? Documentary over, Dean confirmed. You fell asleep during the autumn section. Sorry, Hazel mumbled. Was actually interesting. That artist really loved her tree. She did, Dean agreed, pulling a blanket over her. Obsessive focus on the one thing that mattered to her. I understand that. Your one thing is me, Hazel said, already drifting back to sleep. You're like the artist, focused on one thing, except instead of a tree, you got a daughter who came back from fake death. Best thing I ever got, Dean said softly. Love you, Hazel whispered. Love you, Dad. It was the first time she'd said it. 6 months of rebuilding, of therapy, of careful trust construction, and she'd finally said the words Dean had been afraid to hope for. I love you too, sweetheart, Dean said, his voice breaking. More than anything. More than empire or power or anything I ever built. You're what matters. You're everything. But Hazel was already asleep, breathing steady and peaceful, safe in a room that finally felt like home. Dean left the door open. She still needed that. Still had nightmares sometimes about being trapped or hidden or alone. He went to his own room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, processing everything that had changed in 6 months. He'd lost an empire, had dismantled the organization he'd spent decades building, had traded power and control and fear for family dinners and therapy and ordinary evenings, watching documentaries. And he'd never been happier, never been more certain that he'd made the right choice. Tomorrow he'd return to legitimate business, to investments and construction projects and legal operations, to being Dean Hollis the businessman instead of Dean Hollis the mafia boss, to building wealth through legitimate means instead of violence and intimidation. Tomorrow Hazel would go to school, would do homework and hang out with friends and live the normal teenage life Audrey had stolen from her. Would continue healing, continue growing, continue becoming whoever she was meant to be. Tomorrow Margaret would call to check on them, would plan next week's dinner, would continue being the grandmother she should have been 6 years ago. Tomorrow Dr. Morrison would send session notes, would track their progress, would continue guiding them through the complicated process of becoming family again. Tomorrow the life they were building would continue imperfect, messy, complicated, but real. Built on truth instead of lies, built on choice instead of obligation, built on love that had survived 6 years of grief and hiding and lies that should have destroyed them. Dean had spent his entire adult life believing that power was what mattered, that control and fear and empire meant something, that being extraordinary was better than being ordinary. He'd been wrong about all of it. What mattered was this sleeping daughter down the hall, family that included unlikely people, life that was normal and domestic and completely unremarkable, except for the fact that it was real and chosen and worth every sacrifice he'd made to achieve it. Dean Hollis, former Mafia boss, had finally learned what actually mattered. And it wasn't empire. It was family. It was love. It was ordinary evenings and dinner parties and documentaries about trees. It was Hazel, alive and home and saying, "I love you," before falling asleep. That was everything. That was enough. That was more than he'd ever thought possible. And tomorrow, they'd wake up and continue building it one ordinary day at a time, one honest conversation at a time, one moment of being family at a time. The extraordinary life Dean had built through violence was gone. The ordinary life he was building through love was everything. And for a father who'd spent 6 years mourning a daughter who wasn't dead, for a daughter who'd spent 6 years hiding from a father who wasn't a monster, for a family rebuilding from lies and loss and grief, ordinary was the greatest achievement they could possibly claim. They'd survived the impossible. Now they'd live the ordinary. And that ordinary life, built on truth and choice and stubborn refusal to let 6 years of lies define their future, was the greatest victory either of them would ever know.